Anthrax Island by D. L. Marshall. The John Tyler Series, Book 1. Read by David Morley Hale. For Luby. Chapter 1. My first view of the island was through the fogged lens of a gas mask, though 1,000 feet was too high to fully appreciate the horror below. As we lined up for a second pass, I pressed against the helicopter's window, knocking the mask against the glass. A bleak hill, storm-lashed cliffs jutting from angry waves, no real features in the pale dawn, even less life. My stomach knotted. The Royal Marine opposite leaned against the bulkhead, swinging casually from a cargo strap, like he was riding the tube. I nodded at him, pointing a finger downward. He got my meaning, leaning into the cockpit to talk to the pilot, then dropping into his seat as the helicopter banked. I pulled out my iPhone to fire off one last message and felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to Bates, the burly Glaswegian corporal in the seat next to me. He held out a huge paw, beckoning. I handed him the phone and turned back to the window, watching the murky sea pound the rocks as we swept across the bay. Too dangerous to set down on the island itself. The helicopter lurched. I gripped the seat base. It had been a long, bumpy flight north from HMNB Clyde, the naval base at Fastlane, and I'd been gripping it most of the way. The Marine opposite smirked. I closed my eyes, steadied my breathing, concentrated on the thudding rotors. A minute or so later, the vibrations changed, followed by a jolt that clouted my head against the restraints. Banging, muffled shouting. My eyes were still screwed shut when a rush of cold air swirled around the cabin. I opened them to see the smirking Marine jumping out of the door with my bags. I took a deep breath, unclipped myself, and climbed down after him, relieved to feel spongy grass beneath my boots. The pilot kept the power up, rotors whipping the drizzle into a frenzy. I could see twice fuck all through the stream of droplets on the visor. The world was a crazed mosaic, blurred crags and jagged pines. The roar of the turbines was muffled by the thick rubber over my ears, disorientating me further. I hunched low as I jogged away, arm up in a vain attempt to keep the mask clear, but slid on the wet grass, almost ending up on my arse in the mud. A powerful arm caught me, yanking me sideways. I strained to see a Picasso representation of Bates yelling something unintelligible, but I got the gist as he dragged me, slipping and sliding, down the narrow track to the beach. Smirking Marine was already jogging back towards us. Bates slapped me on the shoulder, yelling something encouraging as I stumbled across the rocks, just reaching the sand when the turbine's pitch increased. Turning as the Merlin helicopter rose from the grassy plateau, I flicked a farewell salute, watching it bank away, climbing rapidly towards the lightening sky to clear the mountains inland. It receded into the distance, the gas mask damping the sound long before the dot disappeared over the snow-capped peaks. I stood there, alone on the beach, listening to my amplified breathing, organizing my thoughts. I felt claustrophobic, desperate to tear off the stifling plastic suit, to taste the cool, salty air. I could have done. There was no danger here on the mainland. But they'd spent ages taping the hood of my hazmat suit to my gas mask, and I didn't fancy replacing it in these conditions. I pulled a clump of tissue from my pocket, and after rubbing the visor, I could see my destination more clearly, though it didn't improve the view. Murky waves stretched seamlessly to the grey horizon. The island was nothing more than a dull, grass-covered rock, gravel spits jutting from beneath a hill at its nearest point, foaming rocks on the other side. Inhospitable, malevolent even. A dark, angular structure poked out from the long shadows behind the island, a huge, prowling shark floating in the murky dawn. I'd had a look at HMS Dauntless when we'd overflown her. Why the Royal Navy had sent a Type 45 destroyer to this tiny island had puzzled locals and crew alike. They'd been told it was part of her sea trials following a refit, though anyone could see the current conditions wouldn't test her. I trudged through the damp sand to where they'd left my gear, a toolbox and a kit bag of personal belongings. Grinyard Bay embraced the island, stretching round through windswept fields and twisted trees, dark mountains and darker sea. The tiny crofting settlement of Lade clung to the hillside further along the coast, a herd of white cottages dotted across the meadows sweeping up from the waves. The ruins of its tiny medieval chapel were just visible, reduced to a pile of rocks through the streaked visor. Somewhere below Lade was a jetty. It would have been far easier to meet a boat there, but the crossing was far shorter here. Plus, those in charge hadn't fancied landing a military chopper in the middle of the village. I didn't blame them. God forbid the press got hold of what was going on. The drone of an outboard motor floated across the bay. I watched a speck grow into a small dinghy. As it buzzed closer, I could see a figure hunched at the helm, a Navy boatman bent double to avoid the worst of the freezing spray. As they approached, I swung the heavy kit bag onto my back. Tape ripped somewhere near my ear as the hood pulled away from my gas mask. The breeze tickled my hair. I shuddered, patting the tape back down. Reality kicked in, dropping heavy through my intestines. Despite the frigid air, sweat tingled my fingertips inside the rubber gloves. Was I crazy for taking the job? Wouldn't be the first time. Low risk, they'd said. Easy cash. I don't know if they'd been lying or mistaken. Either way, I'm selectively naive when I need the money. The outboard snorted as the helmsman beached it on the sand. He made no attempt to leave the dinghy, a moment of impasse as we regarded one another over the grumble of the motor. I could see now the guy wore overalls with a simple filter over his mouth. Total overkill for his task, I thought, yet totally inadequate if things went tits up. "Tyler?" I nodded and picked up the toolbox, wading through the foam. "Get a wriggle on," he added. I briefly considered tipping the bastard out, but instead threw my gear into the dinghy and grabbed the side, dragging it back into the sea, turning it round on a wave. Tiny leaks in my suit soaked my jeans, filling my boots. Like air conditioning, it took my temperature down several degrees, something I hadn't thought possible. When I was waist deep, the helmsman twisted the throttle, which I took as a signal to haul myself in, facing him and the receding beach. Huddled in the grim trees, a lonely, whitewashed cottage watched us leave, curtains twitching. A postcard-perfect scene, ordinarily, but, armed with the knowledge of where I was headed, the dark pines and granite outcrops scowled down. I'd seen a graveyard up there as we'd landed, which suited my mood perfectly. I shivered. My feet were going numb. But if trenchfoot was the only thing I contracted in this godforsaken place, I'd consider myself lucky. The Navy man shouted above the outboard. I lifted a hand to my ear. "What?" "I said I drew the short straw," he yelled. "Taking you out." "Still longer than mine, mate." "So you're the technician?" I glared. I'd been hoping for a quiet ride. "Won't catch me on that island," he continued. "Not a chance, pal." He opened the throttle and the little boat skipped across the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?